Hi, I'm Jetson Leder-Luis. I'm an assistant professor at Questrom in the Department of Markets, Public Policy, and Law. I'm an economist who studies public economics, public policy, and law and economics. Specifically, I look at the economic effects of lawsuits. And at Questrom, I'm involved in the undergraduate business analytics major, teaching students kind of empirical skills to play with data in business contexts. And we can think about, a lease really that governs this relationship between landlord and tenants as being a contract. And in that contract, the landlord and the tenant are going to exchange the use of the property for a pre-specified amount of money, and then they both agree to play by certain rules, both the ones that are set out in the lease and also the ones that are the state rules that govern how landlords and tenants interact with each other. And so we can think about an eviction as being really a civil lawsuit where a landlord is trying to enforce that contract. And there are also ways for a tenant to enforce a contract. Like if a landlord isn't keeping a property up to some sort of state sanitary code, tenants have all these protections in Massachusetts where they can, get the health inspectors involved or withhold rent. And so from that purview, what is the, eviction moratorium? The eviction moratorium is a ban on the landlord's ability to enforce their end of the contract. So if we want to think about the economic effects of the eviction moratorium, we have to understand the economics of this civil lawsuit to enforce a contract. And we know from the study of many civil lawsuits in different circumstances that there are a lot of different factors when you consider these effects. There are the costs of kind of running the lawsuit, costs both to the landlord and to the tenant. There are the economic effects of the lawsuit and its outcome. But then there are also the economic effects of the threat of having a lawsuit. And that's really where I think the eviction moratorium is most impacted. Right? So lawsuits are expensive, and evictions are actually really expensive for both landlords and tenants. I think most landlords don't want to evict tenants because that takes a lot of time and money spent on attorneys. And obviously tenants don't want to be evicted because it might mean that they're either forced to move and find other housing. It can also make it difficult for a tenant to find housing later. So these are really high cost lawsuits. Because of that, I think there are probably a lot of softer negotiations between landlords and tenants. For example, if a tenant loses their job and can't pay, they might set up some sort of a payment plan or a discount on rent. And so we have to think about these evictions as things that happen because the landlord, is really at the point where they're willing to pay high costs to either get the property back and rent it to someone else or to go after a tenant for back payment of rent. And so when we think about those, there are these kind of cost and effects that allow us to measure the effects of these lawsuits. There's this other big factor we have to understand, which is the threat of lawsuits. And we know that the threat of a civil lawsuit can have really big deterrence effects in all sorts of other contexts. And that's no different here. The threat of being sued means that people uphold their contracts, right? People pay their rent because they're afraid of getting evicted. And so the moratorium weakens that threat, but only temporarily, right? I think everyone going into the eviction moratorium knew that this was going to be a short-term thing. So there's still this threat, it's just a threat that's been now delayed down the line. So now what do we think about the kind of bigger economic effects here? Well, economists are generally in favor of strong enforceable contracts. We think they're good for economies. And the thing is that people need to be able to enter into agreements with each other and then believe that they're going to have the ability to uphold those agreements. Otherwise, they might not enter into the agreement in the first place. So if you suspended evictions for like a really long time, we would worry that property owners might become reluctant to rent their properties out to tenants. And that could make it harder in the long term for people to find housing. So taking those both into play, there are these two things that we need to think about. There are two levels of understanding the eviction moratorium. At the basic level, an eviction moratorium is really good for tenants and it's really bad for landlords because tenants are able to break their portion of the contract, break their portion of the lease, right? Not pay their rent and not get evicted. It takes away the landlord's ability to evict them. And that's by design, right? That's exactly why we're doing it. We think that, tenants might not be able to uphold their side of the contract because maybe they've lost their job or they're dealing with other economic effects of COVID. And so we have made it intentionally, possible that people who can't pay their rent don't lose their homes. And there are both moral and also maybe public health reasons why we think that's a good thing. But then there's this second kind of equilibrium idea, which is when you put into effect an eviction moratorium, potentially for a longer time, that can start to distort the market of housing in the Boston area, right? So, or in the Massachusetts area more generally. We would be worried about landlords being unwilling to rent to people, landlords investing in, really scrutinizing their tenants to make sure that they're entering, that they're going to be able to pay their rent. In the long term, we think that this could have potentially negative downstream effects on the housing market, and that could also make it harder for people to find housing down the line. from the framework I've just put onto this problem, right, we can think that there are two levels of understanding it. There are these broader effects of lawsuits and the threat of lawsuits, and then there are costs and benefits of the lawsuits themselves to tenants and to landlords. And there is a trade-off. On one hand, the eviction moratorium is good for tenants, at least in the short term. It means that we give a benefit to tenants who might be economically distressed. And on the other hand, there are the property rights of these landlords and also the potential for economic development or distortions to economic development if we think that people are not going to invest in properties or enter into contracts going forward. And so whether or not there should be an eviction moratorium is ultimately a political question, right? It's a question of how do you prioritize the property rights of those landlords? How do you prioritize economic development versus how much do you think that we should provide protections for individuals who are economically distressed? As with all policy or many policy questions, there is not a right answer. There are effects there are some winners and there are some losers, and I think that whether or not it should continue ultimately comes down to political opinion and what the elected officials think that their constituents are going to respond well to. When it comes to understanding public policy, it's really important to distinguish between knowing what the effects are and then thinking the sort of the normative versus positive distinction, right? Asking the question what things should be. And this is true for all sorts of social problems. That I encourage people to recognize the difference and to be skeptical of anyone that says that things by science ought to be a certain way in public policy. That policy can tell us the effects of laws and policy can tell us the effect of regulations and rules. But whenever there are circumstances like this one where there are winners and losers, there comes a moral and political component that I don't think necessarily has a right answer. It depends a lot on the priorities that we as a society should choose to adopt.